Shalom, shalom, friends. God bless you, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog, exclusively, of course, on the Synagogue. I am your host, CJ Cox, and I am very happy to have you guys here with me today. Those of you who are indeed with me here today. I'm going to go ahead and, of course, stall for time by asking those of you who are here to please like and share this video. Get it out to your different social media accounts, Gab, Parler, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you happen to reside digitally. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? I'd also like to ask, if you have not, please do consider subscribing to this channel, the Synagogue. Hit that bell, of course, if you want to be notified every time we actually are going live or posting a video. I actually do 2 different podcasts on this channel. So if you're interested in politics and news and things like that, that's what we have here today. That's the Watchdog. If you're interested in apologetics and the Christian faith and things like that, we have Unapologetics, and I also do that sometimes here as well. So if you like one of those, you like the other one of those, you like both of those, please do hit that subscribe button and also the bell so you get notified of all the stuff we're going to do. And thank you very much for being here. Again, I am your host, CJ Cox, here today. It does look like I have confirmation that we are live, so everything's good to go. We got a pretty interesting story for you today. A couple of interesting stories for you today. Some of it, of course, you already know, but I'm going to give my thoughts on it anyways. But before we get into the articles, of course, I want to have a brief discussion, as we tend to do. So the discussion is actually on a video that was shown to me. And the person in the video, it's a missionary. I can't remember his name. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's Stephen Smith. But I'm not 100% sure on that. I could be getting it wrong, but nonetheless, the gentleman is making a video responding actually to Ben Shapiro, a person who he actually seems to have a good deal of respect for and agreement with. And the notion that you can actually fight a culture war. Basically, what this missionary Smith is saying, I do know his last name is Smith, so I'll continue to use that, is that you can't actually fight a culture war because the people who are consuming these different elements of culture, right? The people who are consuming the media in forms of, the news, television shows, music, movies, so on and so forth, even things here on YouTube, right? They actually have a given philosophy and a given worldview that leads them to actually enjoy and indeed want and ask for these kinds of things, these sexually perverse kinds of things, these incredibly violent kinds of things, these incredibly woke and woke scoldy kind of things, right? And missionary Smith's point is basically that without actually addressing the heart issue, which can only be addressed through the cross, there's nothing you can actually do to fight a culture war. It's a little bit like, the story of Sisyphus, the famous Greek legend of Sisyphus, where he's, cursed into Hades. And when he's actually down there, he has to, take this really heavy rock and push it up a hill. And as soon as he gets done pushing the rock up the hill, it just falls right back down the hill again. And he has to repeat the process. Right. And it's missionary Smith's point is it's a little similar to that, trying to fight a culture war using culture, right? Rather than actually trying to address the heart of the issue, which is the fact that, quite frankly, we live in a very progressive, quote unquote, culture, right? We don't live in a culture that actually appreciates, for example, traditional marriage anymore, whether that be monogamous, whether that be for life, whether that be marrying young, whether that be heterosexual, right? They don't like these things. We live in a culture that's not very big on the ideas of going to church any longer, not very big on hierarchy, not very big on supporting the troops or supporting the police or keeping the police even in check, knowing that we live in a nation that is bound by a United States Constitution. It's supposed to be different from other nations with its respect and value for human rights, right? We don't live in a culture that wants free speech. We don't live in a culture that wants freedom of religion. We don't live in a culture that wants to actually keep themselves in a non-sexually promiscuous way. We don't live in a culture that is modest, right? Whether that means sexually modest or whether that means modest in the case of having a whole bunch of shiny, fancy things and wanting to show them off to all your friends and enemies as well, right? And frankly, as I may or may not have given off by my tone here today, I completely agree with Missionary Smith. I think it's a little bit ridiculous to sit here and assume that, you know, the media and the education system and everybody has got us down, and people don't actually feel this way. They're just being brainwashed into feeling this way by a bunch of elites, when in reality, that's not actually the case. In fact, the exact opposite is true. We live in a society that very much adores these quote unquote progressive things, whether that's transgenderism, whether that's homosexuality, whether that's no fault divorce, whether that's a religiosity or progressive religiosity. You know, it doesn't really matter. Honestly, it's a whole bunch of different things. But the point is, this is actually where our society is at, culturally speaking. The media, whether that's the news media or the television media or the music industry or whatever, right? The media is only giving the people what they want and ask for, and indeed will give their hard-earned money to see, right? So we need to always remember that when it comes to any of these different things, right? Any of the different things that we're talking about here, you know, this is something that it's not a bunch of elites necessarily keeping people down, right? There are certainly, you know, elites in the world. There are certainly establishment types in the world, right? But what we need to understand is the population itself is quite content in the heated water, if you know what I'm saying. If you remember the analogy of the frog who is swimming in water that gets progressively hotter as time goes on until eventually it just gets itself contently and comfortably cooked. And that's where we're at right now. That is where we are at right now. And I wanted to basically just to bring that up just so we can kind of have this understanding of really, I guess, of where we're at, right? And instead of having this expectation that we're just going to blow everyone away and that in reality, nobody actually agrees with these people. And it's just a whole bunch of kooks in Washington or a whole bunch of kooks for their ivory tower writing news articles and posting them all over the LA Times or whatever, right? That's not the case. Like, go outside and speak to your liberal friends. They agree with these things, right? And even quite frankly, a lot of your so-called conservative friends will too, right? Trump was a little bit of a phenomenon. And even still, as I've said numerous times before, Trump was not really conservative. He certainly wasn't constitutionalist. And at least in the way he carried himself, he wasn't Christian. I'm not going to say that he's not a Christian because only him and God know. But I mean, you know, we could go on the laundry list, right? He was just better than Biden. And of course, he was a little bit of a phenomenon, right? Something that is a little bit rare in the political sphere, honestly. And yeah, you know, I think that's a big deal, right? I think it's, you know, there's no irony, I guess, in, you know, for example, Black Panther hitting $1 billion solely off of the fact that it was a movie that was billed as the first major blockbuster superhero movie that had a black lead, which of course was not actually true. The Spawn movies and the Blade movies had actually come out before it. But since it was billed that way, everybody went to go see it, even more so than established characters like Captain America, Iron Man. I'm pretty sure Black Panther actually did significantly better than at least two of the Avengers, namely 1 and 2. I could be wrong about that, though. The point being, though, that the population is eating it up. They love it, right? They absolutely love it. Sure, the NFL loses some of its views, but not much. Sure, a couple people cancel Netflix, but not many. Sure, a couple people are going to actually leave Disney and start watching Daily Wire movies, but in reality, how big of a percentage do you actually think it will be? And that's my rant to begin this, right? Is that we're not in a culture war. We're in a post-culture war. We lost the culture war, and it's kind of ridiculous at this point to continue fighting the culture war as if it's still going on. At this point, we could have a cultural revival, a sort of revolution, which of course I mean peacefully, not in any way, shape, or form endorsing violence, which I only think would come from the hand of God. And that's actually really one of the big points of this, and that's Missionary Smith's point, really, is that the only way it will actually come is through the hand of Christ and through people actually changing and, you know, becoming more Christian. And I completely agree with that. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point that out, rant about it for a little bit. I completely agreed with Missionary Smith, and so I decided I should say something about it. So we have stuff to talk about. stuff and things and other sorts of that nature. I see that nobody here is commenting quite yet. If you are here, let me know you are here. I'd like to say hello and shalom and all that other good kind of stuff. It does let me know here that at least a couple of people are watching. But nonetheless, obviously, we're going to go ahead and press forward. So the first thing we're going to talk about is actually the headliner, Pope Benedict the 16th, otherwise known as Pope Emeritus, because he is recently actually retired, and recently at this point is 2013. But he resigned, right? Rather than actually taking his position till death, as typically happens, he decided to resign, and he is now Pope Emeritus, while of course Francis is the current and sitting pontiff of Rome. By the way, shalom, Jamie. I see that at least somebody here is interested in saying hello. Not that matters, of course. Anyways. Shalom, brother. Nice to see you here. Fun fact, Jamie has actually told me that potentially he might be getting into some video editing. So I don't know if we will collaborate on that, but we might. Who knows? I'm not very good at responding to anybody's messages, so that's sort of my bad. But nonetheless, yeah, something for you guys to potentially maybe possibly look forward to. Who knows? But nonetheless, Benedict has actually spoken up recently about what he sees as a potential global humanistic dictatorship, and about the fact that he may or may not actually have been forced out of the Vatican, which is not something that has been unknown up until this point. There are certain quote-unquote conspiracy types who have been saying this for quite some time. I'll admit I am not amongst their number, though I've always thought there was something weird about Benedict retiring. I didn't actually make the claim that anyone forced him to. Dr. Taylor Marshall has, Stephen Benoon has, Alex Jones have, a couple more people traditionally considered a little bit more conspiratorial. And of course, a lot of people, even in the mainstream, have at least wondered about it, because popes just typically don't retire. It's not something that usually happens. I think... I don't know if he's a cardinal or an archbishop or what exactly he is, but Vigano had said an awful lot about it, and had actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, he was investigating some stuff with their treasury and some money that was going missing and potential fraud and stuff like that. But I don't know too much about it, so I don't want to give details. But he had been saying stuff about it, right? Nonetheless, now it appears that Benedict himself has something to say about potentially being forced out, and about his critics potentially trying to silence him, and about what he sees as a dangerous revolution within the Catholic Church. Now, before we get into this, I just want to point out for the audience that I do not trust Benedict as far as I can throw him. So even though I believe he is completely correct about these things, namely the threat of a global humanistic dictatorship and an incredibly progressive a-Catholic Catholicism that is currently coming from within the church, and indeed from its very head, which of course, they're already a Christian and still claim the name Christian. So who cares about throwing off another tradition? Am I right? But nonetheless, not to say that those two things are equal also. Nonetheless, even though I agree with Benedict, and even though I'm definitely kind of, in a sense, pleased to hear him speak out, just because it sort of proves that everything that we're talking about here is something that even the highest echelons of the Catholic Church are fully aware of, and they're either for it or against it, but nobody denies it because it's just simply true, right? So I'm very pleased with the information in that sense. However, I do not trust Benedict as far as I could throw him. Only him and God know what's up with him. But the dude covered up an awful lot of sexual assault scandals. The dude had an awful lot of fraud going on during his episcopate. The dude obviously had something against him if he was forced out, because obviously he's not just going to be forced out, by some kind of mafia means or something like that, right? They probably blackmailed him, which is what virtually everybody who has been propagating this conspiracy theory before today has been saying. And I mean, let's just be clear, like there's a lot of evil things that we know for a fact that this person did before he was actually Pope, back in his days of being Joseph Ratzinger, including but not limited to being a member of Hitler Youth. Now, of course, the Holy Spirit can forgive all things, right? The blood of Christ cleanses us from all sins. But again, that's only between Benedict, or I guess his real name would be Joseph, and God. And I just personally don't trust him, right? I don't think he's given us any reason, right, to trust him, especially considering the fact that he did formally head this organization and help cover up all of the dastardly deeds that they were doing. But nonetheless, he does have some stuff that he wants to say. And so we're going to read two different articles, admittedly not from as mainstream of sources as we usually have. However, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a little bit more mainstream sources. And I did make sure that at least one of them, Church Militant here, was still a Catholic source, so that you guys can still have relative faith in the information and know that this isn't from the endtimes.com or something like that, right? So Benedict the 16th speaks out. This is an article from Martin Barrius, and it's from churchmilitant.com, writing from Rome. Real quick, I'm going to take a drink of my tea, actually, before we start. I see Jamie says Tom Horn claims he prophesied it. I don't actually know who Tom Horn is, to be honest with you. Or maybe I do, and I just don't recognize the name at this moment. But that would be interesting if he claimed he did. I'd have to look at those. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of people who seem to claim prophethood or that they've had a prophecy seem to just be frauds. But, you know, it's a situational thing. We'll look at it. Nonetheless, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI accuses his opponents of seeking to silence him, while he also warns against a future humanist dictatorship that may control the world. Now, the hilarious thing about that is that I have been saying that now since, 2016? I don't know how many people watched this from the Facebook days, but that was actually December of 2016 when we started this during the Facebook days, right? But at least even on YouTube, I've been speaking about it since, 2018, 2019? I think it was April 10th, 2019 that I posted my first Watchdog. And we had been talking, obviously, stuff before that as well on unapologetics, because I do think this is a matter of eschatology sometimes. But isn't it interesting that this crazy, batty-eyed fundamentalist Protestant idea that I have is now being echoed by the highest echelons, quite literally the former pontiff himself, right, of the Roman Catholic Church? I mean, what better validation could you possibly have, right? When I'm sitting here saying that the Roman Catholic Church is trying to lead a enigmatic, interreligious, humanistic dictatorship across the globe, and then the members of the Catholic Church, like Joseph Zen, like Edmund Burke, like former Pope Benedict XVI, come out and say it themselves, right? Like, what better validation could you possibly ask for? But nonetheless, we continue. In an authorized biography by German author Peter Seewald, Benedict says in Benedict XVI, A Life, accusations that he has interfered in the current pontificate are based in a, quote, malignant distortion of reality, end quote. Despite some commentary in various circles of the Catholic Church that he may have sought to undermine the current pontiff, Benedict said in the book that his, quote, personal friendship with Pope Francis has not only endured, but grown, end quote. And of course, there you go with some more reasons why we shouldn't necessarily trust him, even though he's saying some things that might validate some of the stuff that we're talking about here, right? Nonetheless, we continue. The remarks are found in the last chapter of Seewald's book, which is based on interviews that took place in late 2019. The book was published in German on May 4th and runs over 1,100 pages. The book is scheduled to appear in English in November as Benedict XVI, the Biography, Volume 1, and an Italian version is expected in September. Benedict told Seewald, that he had prepared a spiritual testament that he will not be revealed, or that rather will not be revealed after his death. He did not elaborate as to its contents, Benedict, who is now 93 years old, resigned from the papacy in 2013, and Francis has been his replacement, being in since February 13th of 2013. On the crisis of doctrine, faith, Benedict takes square aim at legalized same-sex unions. He said, quote, "A century ago, anyone would have thought it absurd to talk about homosexual marriage. Today, those who oppose it are excommunicated from society," end quote. He linked the issue to infanticide and test tube babies, saying, quote, "It's the same thing with abortion and creating human life in the laboratory," end quote. It is only natural for the people who oppose same-sex unions and abortion, to fear the power of the Antichrist. Now, isn't that an interesting phrase to use when calling out your enemies who appear to be within the church, one of which appears to be sitting on the church? In fact, this appearance is so strong to everybody that you constantly have to clarify that the two of you aren't actually fighting. And yet, what's the word that you use, or the term, I should say, to describe this force, I guess you could say, that you're opposing and that traditionalist Catholics are fearing? You call it spiritual power of the Antichrist. Is Benedict XVI calling Francis the Antichrist? That's kind of interesting. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Quote, "Modern society is in the middle of formulating an anti-Christian creed, and if one opposes it, one is being punished by society with excommunication. The fear of the spiritual power of the Antichrist is then only more than natural, and it really needs the help of prayers on the part of an entire diocese and of the universal church in order to resist it," end quote, Benedict said. Quote, "The real threat to the church is in the global dictatorship of purportedly humanist ideologies," end quote. Now, it's funny, right? Because he's not saying anything about the Catholic Church here, right? He's not saying anything about Francis and the Francis Episcopate or the progressives who Francis is actually appointing, right? But the things he's talking about are things which Francis is constantly pushing, right? Francis is constantly pushing that we be more lenient with abortion. Francis is constantly pushing some level of confusion when it comes to homosexual or transgender issues. Francis is literally leading, at least the religious wing, of this, quote, global dictatorship of humanist ideologies. As we've shown numerous times, Shimon Peres literally said that he wanted this man to actually head the future UN of religions. And Pope Francis seems to have taken that to heart. And so Benedict, while on through one end of his mouth, he'll say, "I am not actually trying to undermine Francis." And while he won't, through the other end of his mouth, explicitly say anything about Francis or even the church itself, he will indeed speak through this other end of his mouth clear condemnations of Francis and the current direction that we see the Francis Catholic Church going, and even uses language like spirit of the Antichrist to describe this. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. You think he's referring to the Great Reset? Francis backs it. You think he's referring to the United Nations? Francis backs them. And in fact, their general secretary is a Roman Catholic, Antonio Gutierrez. So on and so forth, right? The WHO, well, Francis backs them, right? So on and so forth. So without saying it, he is saying that he believes, at least in what it appears to me, that Pope Francis at least has the spirit of the Antichrist, or at least that people fear from him the spirit of the Antichrist. On the current state of the Catholic Church, he reflected, quote, "Events have shown by now that the crisis of faith has above all led to a crisis of Christian existence. I personally don't think it is, he is justified in associating the church with Christianity at all. I have said before, and will say it again, Catholicism is easily as different from Christianity as Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnessism, Islam, and etc. But nonetheless, we continue. According to a report at Germany's Kath.net, Benedict remarked, quote, "The spectacle of reaction coming from German theology is so misguided and ill-willed that I would prefer not to speak of it," end quote. And of course, he refers there to I believe Archbishop, but it could be Cardinal Marx and Mueller, both of which have been backed by, you never guessed it, Pope Francis. But of course, he won't mention Francis because that would cause confusion, I guess. I don't know. I personally think it's a little bit more, causes a little bit more confusion and causes a little bit more strife to be, so secretive, I guess, with it. But, whatever. What do I know? In the book, Benedict said, quote, I would rather not analyze the actual reasons why people want to silence my voice, end quote. And of course, it's interesting that he says that when speaking of things like the crisis of faith in the Catholic Church. On his legacy and influence regarding his efforts as pontiff, Benedict said, quote, I didn't just want to promote cleansing in the small world of the curia, not even primarily, but in the church as a whole, end quote. Benedict continues to face criticism from within and without the Catholic Church. For example, British author Austin Ivory, who has written a biography of Francis, told a Chilean newspaper, and actually you guys might recognize that name because he's come up numerous times here in the Watchdog, but nonetheless, told a Chilean newspaper last year the Benedict supporters must be brought to heel, asserting they contribute to an environment of, quote, scandal and of division. Austin Ivory was literally commissioned by Francis to write a biography about Francis, but these guys aren't beefing with each other, trust me. One's calling the other the spirit of the Antichrist, and the other's commissioning people who say that this guy and his followers need to be brought to heel because they have an environment of scandal and division. But trust me, they're not fighting anybody. I know because they told me so. Anyways. Linda Telford, English author of Linda Telford, English author of Women of the Vatican, Female Power in a Male World. Anyways, said in an interview with express.co.uk, which will be on that website here in just a moment, that she, quote, pitied Francis deeply, end quote, following the publication of Benedict's comments. Interesting that a person who writes a what would you call that? Book, I guess. I think this is a book, right? Yeah, author of, so it indicates a book. I thought it might be like an essay or something like that. It looks like it's definitely a book. Women of the Vatican, Female Power in a Male World, right? No surprise that somebody like that is going to be backed by Francis, or is going to have sympathy, I guess I should say, for Francis. Adding apparent fuel to speculation over an alleged rift between the current pope and his predecessor, Telford told the newspaper, quote, Benedict's doing his absolute best to sabotage all the reforms that Francis is trying to bring in, end quote. She credited Francis for, quote, reaching out to LGBT people, end quote, and seeking reform of Catholic teachings about marriage and contraception, Telford added, quote, Benedict has no right to interfere, end quote. I mean, she said it, not me, right? Like, and this is kind of one of the things I say when I say, these aren't conspiracy theories. All you have to do is ask these people. They will tell you, yes, this is exactly what I'm doing, because they agree with it. And honestly, they're baffled that you have a problem with it. Anyways, on his resignation, the Pope Emeritus denied that his 2013 resignation was due to revelations of corruption among Vatican officials that came to be known as the Vatileaks scandal, which this is the whole Vigano thing that I was telling you about. He reveals that doctors, well, I wasn't really telling you about it, I sort of hinted it a little bit, but nonetheless, he reveals that doctors told him that his health was not good enough for international travel, thus making him doubt that he could fulfill his responsibilities. He also said that he was following the example of St. Paul VI and John Paul II by signing a conditional declaration of resignation early in his pontificate, quote, in the event of illness that rendered the proper performance of duties impossible, end quote. Benedict compared his role as Pope Emeritus to the bishops who have retired because of age limits. Currently, bishops and prelates are required to submit their resignation at 75, which must have papal consent. He affirmed that the status can be applied to a pontiff, a bishop of Rome, and said that this dispels, quote, any notion of a coexistence to popes. A diocese can only have one incumbent. At the same time, it expresses a spiritual bond that can never be taken away, end quote. Which I guess means the likelihood of schism is significantly lower than other people are saying. But of course, who knows, right? However, he said that he had not promised to remain silent when he resigned his pontificate. On the dubia challenging Francis, when Seewald asked for a comment about the dubia or questions that 4 cardinals have presented to Pope Francis about his apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, Benedict preferred to refer to his last general audience. Paraphrasing his message of April 27, 2013, Benedict said, quote, "In the church, amidst all the struggles of humanity and the confusing power of the evil spirit, one will always be able to discern the subtlety of God's bounty," end quote. He added, quote, "The darkness in a successive periods of history, will separate the utter joy of being Christian. There are always moments of the church and a Christian's life in which one deeply feels that the Lord loves us, and that love is joy. It is happiness," end quote. In 2016, Cardinals Walter Braunmüller, Robert L. Burke, Carlo Cafara, and I think it's Joachim Meisner published a letter that they had sent to Pope Francis that accompanied 5 questions calling for yes or no answers regarding the Pope's teachings in Amoris Laetitia. Among the questions the cardinals asked was whether the apostolic exhortation would allow Catholics who have been divorced and are living in a new union under civil law to receive the Eucharist. Pope Francis has yet to answer any of these questions, and you can find a watchdog on that issue. Probably it's over a year ago at least at this point. That, you know what? I don't even know that that's true. That might be an old Facebook one. So you might find that on my Facebook page. But anyways, I'm not sure. In the book, Benedict discusses on the gay lobby. In the book, Benedict discusses controversies such as the gay lobby within the church and how he dismantled it. It also addressed his efforts to address clerical sexual abuse during his time as cardinal and pope. And of course, that's basically just a lie because he did not actually address any of those issues while he was pope. In fact, he explicitly tried to cover them up, just like Pope Francis is doing now, and just like John Paul II and numerous others did before him. But we continue. In an interview at Germany's Dom Radio, .day website, KNA editor-in-chief Ludwig Ring-Eiffel said that the portion of the Seewald's pages, that deal with homosexual unions and Benedict's fears of a humanistic dictatorship constitute the most interesting part of the book, obviously. Luigi Acatoli is actually probably how you say that, honestly. I'm pretty sure a double C is a sus sound. But nonetheless, I might be wrong about that. I don't know anything about Italian. Anyways, a journalist and longtime observer of the Vatican claims that Benedict says in the book that the gay lobby consisted of 4 or 5 people and that he managed to dissolve it, which is hilarious considering everything that they managed to accomplish now, but whatever. Anyways, Asatoli asserted that this has never been revealed. Seewald has written several books about Benedict and his cooperation with the Pope Emeritus. Among them, Salt of the Earth, God and the World, not word, it was world, and Last Testament in his own words. So there you have that. But that's not actually the only thing that I want to talk about here. The only article I want to talk about here, at least in regards to Benedict. We also go over here to Express, as I promised. Yeah, I accept your stupid cookies, dude. Where we see Benedict pushed into resignation and did not wish to go as Francis took Vatican. Now, it is interesting. What we just read seemingly contradicted this. So what is it that Express might have to say that may or may not indicate that perhaps Benedict actually was forced out of the episcopate? Let's go ahead and figure this out. Oop, this is actually too zoomed in. Just a moment. I don't know how many people actually follow along with me and read, but nonetheless, I like to zoom in just in case anyone actually does. Pope Benedict pushed into resignation and did not wish to go as Francis took the Vatican. Pope Benedict was pushed into resignation as head of the Vatican Church and, quote, did not wish to go, end quote, before Pope Francis was installed as his successor, an author has told express.co.uk. This is from Clive Hammond, February 18th, 2021. Excuse me. The former pontiff resigned in 2013, with Benedict citing his declining health due to old age as the main factor behind his unprecedented move. His decision paved the way for Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who would be named Francis, to be elected as the new Vatican head, sparking optimism in some circles that a much-needed modernization program to revitalize the Catholic Church would be installed. Yet uncertainty surrounding Benedict's position was unearthed when Sebastian Gomez, detailed how, quote, leaks, scandal, and a referential attitude among its most powerful administrators had crippled the Vatican, end quote, under Benedict's stewardship. So that's obviously, like I said, relatively interesting. Seems an awful lot different than what we just heard. So what does Sebastian Gomez have to say? Mr. Gomez said, quote, the internal crisis in the end broke Benedict's back, end quote. Vatican author Linda Telford told express.co.uk that Benedict's incapability to handle major issues at the top of the church, including Catholic sex abuse scandals, had seen insiders feel a change at the top was needed. We actually saw her in the previous article, did we not? She argued that as Benedict still remains in the upper echelons of the church, where he still resides inside the Vatican, he has managed to further his influence despite leaving his post 8 years ago. When asked whether Benedict was forced into his resignation, Ms. Telford said, quote, yes, he was certainly pushed. That he did not wish to go has been evident all through the reign of Francis, where Benedict has tried to control events from the background and unfortunately has been all too effective in his opposition to any much-needed reforms. He's been he's been as obstructive as possible ever since his retirement from ill health, yet here he still is, still interfering, end quote. Ms. Telford, who penned Women in the Vatican, Female Power in a Male World, said he was, quote, asked to leave because of the inability to show that serious matters were being dealt with, end quote, something she suggested people now demand. All the time of his resignation, the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religious and Public Life found he was popular among most Catholic worshippers, but many were deeply unhappy of his handling of issues such as the sex abuse scandal. Kind of interesting, right? Here we have people who apparently do have a little bit of an in with Francis, who are claiming that he is actually forced out somehow and that it had something to do with the sexual abuse. Are they telling the truth? Are they not? Do they have the evidence? I don't really know, but I think it is very interesting to be reporting nonetheless. I do think it's worthy of note that the sexual abuse has not stopped, nor has the cover-up of it under the Francis episcopate. So if that was the reason people used to force him out, they certainly didn't mean it. It was certainly something a little bit more nefarious than that, and they were just using that as a ploy to actually remove him. I happen to think it's possible that he was forced out. I happen to agree with Ms. Telford that his behavior seems to indicate that he did not want to leave. It doesn't appear that he's in poor health, at least, not too poor of health to do what a pope would be doing, which he's already kind of doing anyways, right, as Pope Emeritus. Excuse me. And I think it's likely that the elements that forced him out were probably progressive elements within the Catholic Church, which wished to establish specifically Bergoglio, or as we know him now today, Francis, in there. For those of you who may not recall, back in 2013, when Francis was elected, it was actually kind of a shock. It came out of left field, right? Nobody was expecting Jorge Mario Bergoglio to be the name called. And everything since then has been just as shocking. And that does lead me to believe that if anything did actually happen here where Benedict was forced out, that would probably be the case. With that being said, though, I don't know that that's the case, right? I do know that I don't trust Benedict as far as I can throw him, and that Francis seems to be leading this humanistic dictatorship just as Benedict is saying. And I also know that that is incredible validation of my position because, as Ms. Telford had just pointed out, this man is still absolutely still within the highest echelons of the Catholic Church. Frankly, he is the second most influential and powerful voice in all of Catholicism, second only to Pope Francis. And I think that's absolutely a given. But nonetheless, we're done talking about the pontiff today. We got some other stuff to talk about. Been going on for 40 minutes, it looks like. And the next thing we're going to be talking about here today is actually some, you've already heard of it. It's very unfortunate. We're back to the forever wars. The United States has struck Syria. Yes, the United States has struck Syria. Of course, nobody is surprised by this at this point. I'm a little bit late to the party and giving you my thoughts, but we're going to read an article real quick, and I'm going to give you my thoughts. Can you guys hear this? I hope not, because if you can, I cannot. No, the audio is not on. Okay, good. I want to pause it anyway. It's making me uncomfortable. So, this is from ABC News. You, of course, have probably already heard this from other places, but if you have not, then you heard it here first on the Watchdog. The United States today, 15 hours ago, in fact, is when this was breaking, carries out airstrikes against Iranian-backed militia in Syria. Unilateral, without the consent of Congress, but of course, what's new, right? What is new? Anyways, the United States conducted a military airstrike in eastern Syria along the border with Iraq on Thursday night, targeting Iranian-backed, militias in retaliation for a recent rocket strike in Erbil in northern Iraq that left several Americans injured, according to the Pentagon. And we'll get to that in a moment. The airstrike targeted structures in the eastern Syrian town of Abu Kamal that belong to two Iranian-backed militias that have launched rocket attacks in the past against American facilities in Iraq, including the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, according to a U.S. official. Quote, at President Biden's direction, U.S. military forces earlier this evening conducted airstrikes against infrastructure utilized by Iranian-backed militant groups in eastern Syria, end quote. John Kirby, Pentagon spokesman, said in a statement issued Thursday night. I see Jamie Russell says no. Yes, unfortunately, Brother Russell, Brother Jamie, I should say, sorry. We are indeed back to the forever wars. Back to striking and bombing foreign nations that we have no business being in. Which, of course, is something that I do believe this nation will be held accountable in judgment from God for. We have massacred millions of people in the Middle East and in the Far East for ridiculous political agendas that we don't even end up succeeding in, and that don't even match our own constitutional requirements for violent action. But whatever, that's neither here nor there, I guess. Excuse me. More U.S. military conducts airstrikes in... Sorry, no. That's an article. My apologies. Quote, these strikes were authorized in response to recent attacks against Americans and coalition personnel in Iraq and to ongoing threats to those personnel, end quote, Kirby continued. Quote, specifically, the strikes destroyed multiple facilities located at a border control point used by a number of Iranian-backed militant groups, including Kataib Hezbollah, or just Hezbollah, as we usually call them, and Kataib Saeed el-Shuhada, or the KSS. End quote. Another official described the airstrike as targeting a location through which both groups engaged in smuggling into Iraq. Now, there are probably many of you wondering, CJ, how could you have a problem with us retaliating when people attacked our boys over there, and presumably unprovoked, you might add? To which I say, what exactly are our boys doing over there in the first place? I don't recall Congress having a declaration of war against Syria. It's not our freaking business, okay? There is no necessity for soldiers to be killing or being killed, injuring or being injured in the nation of Syria because it is not our business. It was not our business when Trump decided to send Tomahawk missiles over there. It was not our business when President Obama decided to give a bunch of weapons to the, quote, Free Syrian Army that just ended up in the hands of ISIS, as if the two weren't the same thing at the time, right? It wasn't any different when when President George Bush wanted to go in and have quote unquote Iraqi freedom because of these non-existent WMDs, excuse me, weapons of mass destruction, right? It's not any different regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office. We are not justified in bombing a bunch of countries weaker than us simply because we have a problem with whoever happens to sit in their presidential seat. Okay? We're not an empire. At least not in name. We definitely are de facto an empire, that's for sure. And we remind the world of that all the time. Here we are doing it again. They attacked us. Yeah, what were we doing there in the first place? It's the Syrian civil war. It has nothing to do with us. Anyways, continuing on. Oh, and by the way, I would just like to point out, if we weren't constantly hamstringing the nations of Israel and Saudi Arabia, they would have already taken care of this. But no, we have to be the ones to actually solve the problems. We can't allow the people who actually have a dog in the fight to go and put their dog in the fight and win for their nation. No, we have to control our little colonies and make sure they do daddy's bidding while we send the Imperial Army over there to go bomb brown kids. Oh, you don't like that, bombing of brown kids, Democrats. Well, you're the ones who voted for it. Although, to be fair, not that the Republicans are much better, right? Let's be honest, right? The Republicans, when it comes to war, are not much better. Trump may not have started any wars, but he certainly went and attacked people without the consent of Congress. He didn't end any wars, that's for sure. And he absolutely was threatening every single country in the world. We were going to destroy North Korea. We were going to invade Venezuela. We were going to put more troops in Syria. He didn't do any of those things, thank God. And don't even get me started on George Bush. Do not even get me started on George Bush. Right? George Bush and Barack Obama are among the greatest war criminals in American history. But anyways, quote, this proportionate military response was conducted together with diplomatic measures, including consultation with coalition partners, end quote, said Kirby. Quote, the operation sends an unambiguous message. President Biden will act to protect American and coalition personnel. At the same time, we have acted in a deliberate manner that aims to de-escalate the overall situation in both eastern Syria and Iraq. De-escalate. That's how we de-escalate things, is by keeping troops in areas that we have no business in, where we have no dog in the fight, and also bombing people. Whatever. I don't know. Up is down, left is right, black is white. Whatever, right? Boy is girl. They actually believe that one. The airstrike was the airstrike. I keep saying airstrike as if that's a thing. The airstrike was in retaliation for a February 15th rocket attack against a U.S. base in the northern Iraqi city of Erbil that killed a coalition contractor and left several American contractors and a U.S. military service member wounded. The airstrikes took place at around 6 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday. Quick question. Do we have a congressional declaration of war against Iraq? No. What are we doing in Iraq? I don't know. Do we have a congressional declaration of war against Syria? No. So what are we doing in Syria? I don't know. Just pointing that out. You know, the last time we actually declared war in the way that the Constitution says that we have the right to take military action was World War freaking II. Bet you didn't. No, see, now we just have these police actions. Let the United States president do whatever he wants, like he's some kind of dictator. Oh, wait a minute. He is some kind of dictator. Quote, we're confident in the target we went after. We know what we hit. We're confident that the target was being used by the same Shia militia that conducted the strikes, end quote. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin told reporters while returning to Washington, D.C. from a trip in California. Austin said he had recommended the airstrike to Biden and added that the U.S. had encouraged the Iraqi government, quote, to investigate and develop intelligence that was very helpful to us in refining the target, end quote. He said the administration's approach about how to respond to the rocket attack in Erbil had been, quote, very deliberate, end quote, to ensure connectivity of the militia to the attack and that, quote, we had the right targets, end quote. The airstrike was conducted by 2 American military aircraft though only one of them dropped at least one bomb on the target. The strike may have resulted in, quote, a handful of fatalities, end quote, according to a U.S. official, which, of course, I mean, how much is a handful, right? Like, but whatever, you know. I don't know. Not that we need specifics here or anything like that. The target of the facility was the smallest military operation presented to Biden, the official told ABC News, which is, of course, indication that he is surrounded by a bunch of warmongers, because they're always surrounded by a bunch of warmongers. And this goes for Donald Trump also. He was also surrounded by a bunch of warmongers, right? Rex Tillerson, John Bolton, Mad Dog Mattis. He appointed these people, by the way, right? The decision to strike at a militia's target inside of Syria and not inside of Iraq was seen as a smart move by national security analysts. Thursday's airstrike, quote, was probably calculated and scaled to avoid an escalation and send a message that Iran's use of militias as proxies will not allow them to avoid responsibility, end quote, said Mick Mulroy, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East and an ABC News contributor. And quote, start quote, excuse me. The decision to strike in Syria instead of Iraq was likely to avoid causing issues for the Iraqi government, a key partner in the continuing efforts against ISIS, end quote. Which, I mean, whatever. I mean, I don't think we should be there. Like I am saying, I don't think that all this calculation and retaliation and whatever, it doesn't matter. We shouldn't be there, period. There is no reason for any United States soldier to be in Iraq or Syria. Period. End of the conversation. Like, this isn't a hard thing, right? We don't need to have bases in 95 sovereign nations, right? I know people stationed in freaking Honduras, for crying out loud, right? Like, we do not need this. Are we an empire? In theory, the answer should be no. I think we all know at this point that that answer is not correct. Quote, this was a very smart move by the Biden administration, end quote, said Philip Smith, a Soref fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who studies Iran's proxy militias in Iraq and Syria. By striking an area in Syria completely controlled by Iranian-backed militias, Smith said, the U.S., quote, eliminated the risk of the Iraqi street, which is increasingly nationalistic, anti-Iran and wary of the U.S., from getting upset by what could be perceived to be a unilateral strike within Iraqi territory, end quote. I wonder why they would be wary of the United States. 400,000 dead at a minimum in a war that was illegal by our own constitutional standards. I wonder why they would be wary of the United States. Let me know if y'all can figure that one out. We'll give you your Nobel Prize for being a genius. Quote, the rocket attacks that triggered this were meant to, test the Biden White House, and that's a very Iranian thing to do, end quote, said Doug London, a 34-year CIA veteran and the author of the forthcoming book, quote, The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence, end quote. Which, just for the record, if we actually were going to do something against Iran, then obviously we would need to actually do something against Iran, right? Declare war, get the army there, boots on the ground, get dominance over both the sea and the land, take them out, take out the government, utterly destroy them, and then move on. Not fight these forever wars. But of course, that's not what anybody wants to do. Not the beginning of that, which is going through the constitutional process to actually declare war, and not anywhere near the end of it either, which is actually going there to get the job done. I personally am growing more and more anti-war as time is going on, but I do still believe if you're going to go to war, you got to definitely get the job done. It's not a game, right? You're not meant to just sit there. But you know that actually, while we're on this, let me just point out, do you know that the war on terror, if it were a person, would be able to actually buy, no, not quite, wouldn't be able to buy alcohol quite yet. Would be 20 years old at this point, almost able to buy alcohol. Do you understand that the war in Iraq, us being in Iraq, actually would be 18 years old at this point in time, would be an adult? We are still there. Why? Osama bin Laden has been dead since I was 14 years old. Saddam Hussein has been dead since I was 8. What are we doing in these countries? Anyways, quote, I think this was a very measured and appropriate way to respond by targeting the group KH targeted targeting Iran, but doing it in Syria as opposed to Iraq, end quote, said London. Various lawmakers reacted to the news Thursday night, many commending Biden for his decision. Of course, they're going to, mention those guys without mentioning any of the guys who would go after him. But whatever, right? This is just the way that the news wants to be. They want to paint him in the best possible light because he's not Trump, and also because he has a D next to his name, right? I mean, he could literally be a glass of water, as Nancy Pelosi famously said. The media wouldn't care as long as he had a D next to his name. Quote, appreciate Biden administration striking Iranian-backed militias in Syria who've been pushing attacks against American forces in Iraq and other locations. It is imperative that our enemies know that attacking Americans comes at a cost, end quote, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted. Quote, very supportive of the strike and hope it will create necessary deterrence in the future, end quote. Florida Senator Marco Rubio had a similar response. Quote, Iranian-backed militias have launched 3 attacks against Americans in the last 2 weeks. The strikes ordered by POTUS against these militias tonight were targeted, proportional, and necessary, end quote, he tweeted. Just in case you thought that the Republican Party was somehow anti-war and was actually wanting to respect the Constitution and have a congressional declaration of war and any of that kind of stuff, or was interested in actually getting our troops out of these forever wars. Psych! They're not. Anyways, by the way, Marco Rubio is even supposed, and so is Lindsey Graham, by the way, is even supposed to be one of them old Tea Party cats, right? Who is supposed to be super constitutional and all that kind of stuff. Psych. Quote, today's airstrikes demonstrate POTUS, at POTUS, I guess this is a tweet, resolve to prevent, today's airstrike demonstrates POTUS's resolve to prevent Iran from targeting America's personnel and allies with impunity. It was a strong act that will surely send a message to Tehran that our country will not abide destabilizing actions from its forces or its proxies, end quote, tweeted Representative Steiner Hoyer, a Democrat from Maryland, the majority leader of the House. The Pentagon had not blamed Iranian-backed militias for the attack in Erbil, even though forensic evidence recovered soon after the attack pointed to a connection to Iranian-backed militias that have conducted similar attacks in the past. Excuse me. As Biden administration officials said, the attack remained under investigation. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said last week that the U.S., quote, reserves the right to respond in the time and manner of our choosing, end quote, to the attack. Very, very interesting, because she actually tweeted, what authority does President Trump have to unilaterally attack a sovereign country like Syria, which is the correct opinion, by the way, back in 2017 when Trump had launched the Tomahawk missiles. But of course, now that her guy is in power, it's totally different. Earlier on Thursday, the Kurdish government in northern Iraq claimed that it had identified suspects in the attack and had provided that information to the Iraqi government and the U.S. military in Baghdad. Thursday's airstrike will not be the first time, or was not rather the first time, that the U.S. military has targeted Kataib Hezbollah. It did previously in retaliation for a rocket attack on a military base that killed 2 American service members and a British service member and wounded 14 others. Again, leave and let Israel and Saudi Arabia deal with it. It's not like we're not funding their militaries anyways, right? What do we have to be there for? But whatever. So we're back to normalcy, folks. We are back to normalcy. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that we're back to bombing brown kids over in the Middle East without constitutional authority. Not that that really changed under the Trump administration, but it was at least toned down a little itsy bitsy bit, which I will give him credit for. Little itty bitty bit of credit. But yeah, here we are. This is life. It's terrible, I know. We still have one more thing to talk about, and it's not exactly good. But of course, news is never good, so what were you expecting? But at any rate, Pentagon thinks Russia is a threat to human existence. Or the way I actually worded it here is, Pentagon thinks Russia threatens human existence. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Pentagon believes that Russia will be a threat, or in this case is threatening human existence. By the way, before we continue on with our last article of the day, please do like, please do share, please do get this out to all the different social media platforms which you happen to enjoy. And please subscribe if you have not done so. Hit that bell if you're interested in knowing when we're actually going to go live or post a video. And by the way, if you would like to support us on Patreon, as you can see in the little banner that is going, across the bottom of my screen, you can go to Patreon and go to the synagogue to actually make sure that we can continuously get more and more of these messages out and support this news broadcast. But anyways, let's get back to what it is that we're doing. Newsweek, Pentagon brands Russia existential threat as Joe Biden condemns the nation's recklessness. One more time. Pentagon brands Russia an existential threat as Joe Biden condemns the nation's recklessness. So even further warmongering. This time not necessarily with bombs, but with rhetoric. This comes from David Brennan, and the article is from Newsweek via MSN. A top Pentagon commander has warned that Russia remains an existential threat to the U.S. and its NATO allies, as President Joe Biden looks to confront Moscow on issues he and his Democratic allies believe were ignored under former President Donald Trump, which, of course, is hilarious because Donald Trump was just as harsh with Russia as George Bush, just as harsh with Russia as Barack Obama. Nothing changed. In fact, it was one of the big disappointments, in my opinion, of the Trump administration because he promised us he would at least try, at least from an American first perspective, of course, to bring some level of peace with Russia. He did not try. And now, of course, we have people who are going to try even less because, world wars haven't actually happened in quite some time. So I think that we're due for another. Don't you? I don't know. The people who run our nation seem to think so. The commander of the U.S. European Command, Air Force General Todd D. Walters, said Wednesday that the U.S. is now in, quote, an era of global power competition, end quote. One American must win to ensure, one America is what they probably mean, must win to ensure, quote, global power competition does not become a global power war, end quote. Now, of course, this is actually kind of true, but the article's focus is actually not the focus that I think we should have, but one of Walter's other focuses, China, is the one that I think we should actually be worried about. The same one that, of course, President Biden just recently said was totally cool to be slaughtering Uyghurs in concentration camps because, that's just a cultural difference. Whatever. The U.S. military budget still... Oh, wait, hang on. I skipped something. Walters said Russia and China are the prime threats to American hegemony, and that both are working to undermine U.S. global power projection and upgrade their own military forces. The U.S. military budget still eclipses that of both Russia and China combined, but the Pentagon is pivoting away from the asymmetric warfare and counterterrorism operations that have formed most of its activities over the past 2 decades and towards a more traditional great power competition stance. So allegedly, we might actually be building our military back up in a traditional way, and it is because of China and Russia, is what this is saying. Despite widespread international condemnation and continued economic sanctions, Russia engages in destabilizing and malign activities across the globe, with many of those activities happening close to home, end quote, Walters said, referring to Moscow's agitation and aggression in Europe, which, of course, is not our home. Our home is the United States, but whatever. This is particularly pointed in former Soviet states like Ukraine and Georgia, Walters said. Moscow is using both conventional forces and covert actions to do so, as well as employing private military contractors, for example, the Wagner Group, to do the Kremlin's bidding in Europe and further afield in nations including Syria, Libya, and the Central African Republic. Did you hear that? Syria. Interesting. Isn't that the nation that we just struck with bombs? Could these things be related? I don't know. What do you think? This is particularly, I just read that. Sorry. Quote, Russia remains an enduring existential threat to the United States and our European allies, end quote, Walters warned. Both Russia and China are using commercial investment to gain footholds in strategic locations, Walters added. This includes in the Arctic, where a great power competition is already brewing as retreating ice caused by climate change opens up new sea lanes and lucrative natural resources. Which, whatever. There's a lot of crap in that statement, but I'm not going to go ahead and reference it all. Quote, the activities by Russia and China illustrate the importance of EU COM or EUCOM to come together with our allies and partners to maintain a credible Arctic deterrence and ensure vital sea lines of communication remain open by securing the Greenland, Iceland, and United Kingdom gap, end quote, Walters warned. Biden is found to take a tough line on Kremlin abuses and territorial aggression. Since taking office, the president's team has condemned President Vladimir Putin's suppression of domestic opposition and its covert foreign operations campaign to silence dissidents and undermine liberal democracies. Yeah, see, Russia can't silence dissidents, but we can. Not, of course, that I agree with Russia silencing dissidents. I just think it's funny that we're currently doing that here in the United States. But anyways. Quote, the Kremlin attacks our democracies and weaponizes corruption to try to undermine our system of governance, end quote, Biden said last week in a speech at the Munich Security Conference. Quote, Russian leaders want people to think that our system is more corrupt or as corrupt as theirs, but the world knows that isn't true, including Russians. You certainly got me fooled. You absolutely have got me fooled. In fact, I'm fairly certain that there is currently something like 5,000 soldiers holding our capital under military occupation precisely because we are that corrupt. But whatever. Putin loomed over Trump's time in office with significant evidence that the Kremlin worked to support his 2016 campaign and stoke social divisions in the U.S. national security officials I messed that up. Putin loomed over Trump's time in office with significant evidence that the Kremlin works to support his 2016 presidential campaign and stoke social divisions in the U.S. National security officials also warned that Putin sought to denigrate the Biden campaign during the 2020 race. This, of course, is two falsehoods. Number one, the Mueller report found definitively and without doubt that there was no Russia collusion within the Trump administration. Number two, it was reported very early on after the Kremlin had support for Sanders, that the Kremlin was actually pushing support for Biden. The Kremlin was simply pushing support for people who they thought were going to be disastrous for the United States, according to the people who were pushing these reports. And I don't even know that I believe the reports, frankly. I kind of believe a lot of the threatening and bloviating that comes from Russia is because of the fact that we continuously push this dog into a corner, so to speak. And a dog, when pushed into a corner, does tend to lash out, right? We would like them to get to the point where, like a good abused little puppy, they just cower. But unfortunately for us, Russia doesn't seem to want to do that sort of thing. And Russia is definitely an existential threat to us in that they have lots of bombs, a very powerful army, and a ton of allies, including but not limited to China and Iran, by the way. Quote, Putin seeks to weaken the European project in our NATO alliance, end quote, Biden said last week. Quote, he wants to undermine the transatlantic unity and our resolve because it's so much easier for the Kremlin to bully and threaten individual states than it is to negotiate with a strong and closely united transatlantic community, end quote. Quote, that's why standing up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine remains a vital concern for Europe and the United States, end quote, Biden added. Quote, that's why addressing recklessness, Russian recklessness, and hacking into computer networks in the United States and across Europe and the world has become critical to protecting our collective security. The challenges with Russia may be different than the ones with China, but they're just as real. Actually, that is exactly what China has been doing. And, by the way, fun fact, Biden, you've decided you don't want to do anything about China because apparently that's just cultural differences. You're a regular Neville Chamberlain, my guy. Anyways, Biden's remark received a frosty review in Russia. Of course they would. Moscow's deputy permanent representative to the United Nations, Dmitry Polansky, told reporters Wednesday that the president's speech gave, quote, cause for concern about how we will substantially cooperate with the U.S., end quote. Quote, it is very difficult to imagine how the interaction with us might change with such starting positions of the new administration, end quote, he added. And thus ends the article. What do we make of all this? I have to be honest with you, I don't really know what we make of all this. To an extent, I think that it is somewhat of an inevitability that we go to war with the China, Iran, Russia coalition at some point. I don't know when that point is, but it does seem like regardless of who gets in, where we never actually move towards peace with Russia. We never actually move towards de-escalation with Russia. We never actually move towards holding China accountable, respecting our constitution and declarations of wars, getting out of forever wars and proxy wars. On top of that, the economy continues to collapse. And I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I do know that I don't like it. I don't like all of these reports of, this or that nation is an existential threat. I really don't even like a lot of the stuff that we say about China, even though I do firmly believe that, unfortunately, China is a real enough threat that we have to do something about them. But like I said, I'm kind of becoming more and more pacifistic as life is going on for me. And I don't like this kind of stuff. I think we're dangerously close to a third world war. We have been, frankly, since the 90s. And just like the thing that we are always talking about a potential civil war in the States, right? All it takes is a little spark, right? For whatever reason, a lot of the sparks, both in the U.S. case and in the global case, seem to not actually catch flame. But one day, the spark will, right? And it's going to be a brutal day. I mean, that's all I got to say, right? That's all I got to say in regards to that. Let's see. Who did we have here in the chat? Brady D looks like is the only other person who actually came in. Let's see what else she said. But we voted for Trump. 70% of us. We can't stop them from stealing the election. Let's believe it's Joe won by his overwhelming campaign of massive support. He says they wouldn't let Trump try. Even if he did, they would say proof of collusion. Lame reason, but not to, but true. I think that's partially true. But I do think it's also partially true that it was kind of rhetoric, honestly. I don't think Trump was really that interested in making peace with Russia. I don't think he was really that interested in a lot of the stuff he did. I got to be honest with you guys. Was he better than the alternative? Yeah, but the alternative was a semi-sapient bowl of pudding, okay? Trump is not this godsend that everybody thought he was. He was very liberal. He was very populistic in ways that are not good. He was very willing to deal with corruption, both abroad and within his own administration. He was constantly appointing people who were the exact opposite of what we wanted, like Rex Tillerson, like Mad Dog Mattis, right? Like John Bolton, right? And he was constantly undermining those who actually did have an America First outlook, like, for example, Jeff Sessions, who he replaced with the absolutely incompetent Bill Barr. And I mean, I just got to be honest with you, right? Like Trump was not what you thought he was. You know what I mean? And I'm sorry to say that, but I think it's true. Nonetheless, what else we got here? Universal Artisan just showed up. Hello, Universal Artisan. What just happened? Ian Spiker says, sorry, I'm not chatting, making some tunes with you in the background. Yeah, no, perfectly cool, Ian. I'm glad to have you here at all. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate anybody being here. Real quick, I got to just put a little message in the live chat. Like, share, and subscribe. Yeah. But, definitely happy to have you here at all. I appreciate you guys for sure. Obviously watching this program, especially for those of you who watch it all the way through or mostly the way through, is a huge, version of support here. So I appreciate that. But with that, I think it's about time for us to skedaddle on out of here. So if you like this, please do like and share this video. Please get it out to all the different social media platforms you happen to enjoy. Again, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? Please do subscribe if you have not done so. Hit that bell so you can get notified every single time that we are actually going live. We do 2 podcasts here, both the Watchdog, which is the one you're watching now about politics and news, and Unapologetics, which is a apologetics, podcast. We're probably going to split it into 2 different channels at some point, just so one is mostly focused on apologetics and one is mostly focused on politics, but both of them we do to the glory of God. So that's currently why we have them as one and the same. And of course, both of them I am the host of. So there's that. I also do post debates and live rooms that are sort of general here every once in a while. So if you're interested in those, please do check those out as well. Also, if you'd like to support us financially, I aim on making this as a career. If you think this kind of information, I know it's unique, but if you think it's important, please do consider helping me actually get to the point where we can make this a solid career. I, of course, appreciate anything that anybody here is willing to do. All glory to God. And I have one question for you before we actually leave, because we are living in biblical times. And in these biblical times, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise